February 8, 1587. Fotheringhay Castle, England. A great hall shrouded in silence, thick with anticipation. At the center stands a scaffold draped in black. Torches flicker against cold stone walls, casting long shadows across a crowd of nobles, guards, and silent witnesses summoned to watch the end of a queen. Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots, enters. 64 years of age, imprisoned for nearly 2 decades, she walks with a regal bearing that no chain could diminish. Dressed in deep crimson, the color of martyrdom, she seems less like a prisoner and more like a monarch striding toward destiny. In her hands, a crucifix. On her lips, a prayer. This is not the Mary who once dazzled the French court as a radiant young bride. Not the Mary who returned to Scotland crowned in glory. Not the Mary who defied enemies, survived scandals, and dreamed of uniting 2 thrones. This is Mary at the end of her road, a queen condemned by her cousin, Elizabeth I of England, for treason and conspiracy. The crowd stirs. Some cross themselves. Others whisper that they are witnessing history. Mary mounts the scaffold, and with a steady voice, she proclaims, "I am a Catholic, faithful to the true Church. I die for my faith, and for the rights of my crown. May God forgive all those who have conspired against me." She kneels. The executioner steps forward, axe in hand. The hall holds its breath. With a swing of steel, the blade comes down, once, twice, thrice, until the queen's head is severed, her crimson-clad body collapsing upon the scaffold. Gasps echo. A crownless head rolls into straw. And in that terrible silence, a legend is born. Mary, Queen of Scots. A monarch who lived and died as both a queen and a prisoner. A woman whose life was an opera of love, betrayal, scandal, and blood. A rival to Elizabeth, a pawn of destiny, and a tragic heroine crushed by the grinding wheels of history. But how did this woman, born to rule, end her days on the scaffold? How did beauty, power, and passion turn into betrayal, confinement, and death? To understand Mary's fate, we must turn back to the beginning, back to a child queen crowned in her cradle, a girl destined for greatness, and a woman ensnared by history itself. December 1542. Scotland lay frozen beneath a sheet of snow when destiny arrived in the form of a child. Mary Stuart was born at Linlithgow Palace, a red-haired infant with the blood of kings in her veins. Only 6 days later, her father, King James V of Scotland, died, some say of fever, others whisper of heartbreak after defeat in battle. With his final breath, the infant, Mary became Queen of Scots, one of the youngest monarchs in European history. A crown was set upon the cradle. It was a crown heavier than iron, heavier than stone. It was the weight of a kingdom at war, a realm torn between Catholic loyalty to Rome and the new Protestant faith sweeping through Europe, and all of it balanced upon the head of a child who could not yet walk, speak, or even open her eyes to the storm gathering around her. Her early years were shrouded in peril. Scotland was a chessboard for powerful players. English armies sought to claim her hand in marriage for young Prince Edward, while French envoys whispered promises of protection. To many, Mary was not a baby but a pawn in a continental struggle. Yet even as a child, she possessed an aura that seemed to silence courtiers, as though destiny itself surrounded her. By age 5, she was spirited away across the sea to France, into the glittering heart of the Valois court. If Scotland was cold stone and turmoil, France was gold and silk. Mary was raised not as a mere princess, but as a future Queen of France. Educated by the finest tutors, she mastered Latin, Greek, Italian, Spanish, and of course, the art of charm. She learned music, dance, poetry, hunting, and falconry. Every gesture she made seemed touched with grace, every word a melody. At the French court, the young Mary was a star. Chroniclers describe her as tall, luminous, her skin pale as porcelain, her eyes sparkling with intelligence. She carried herself with a confidence far beyond her years, dazzling courtiers and intimidating rivals. Even Catherine de' Medici, the formidable Queen Mother of France, regarded her with suspicion, knowing that this Scottish princess possessed a magnetism that could eclipse her own children. And then there was François, the Dauphin of France. Sickly, delicate, and timid, he seemed a fragile boy beside the radiant Mary. Yet the two were bound together, a marriage arranged by politics but sealed by youthful devotion. When Mary and François walked side by side, France saw a future couple destined to rule two kingdoms. The girl from the rugged north, refined by French culture, seemed poised to unite Scotland, France, and perhaps even England, through her bloodline. But destiny was never kind to Mary. Beneath the glitter of court life, shadows lingered. She was watched, whispered about, envied. Her beauty was her weapon, but also her curse. Some called her an enchantress, a siren whose very presence unsettled the balance of power. Others saw her as the embodiment of Catholic hope in a Europe increasingly torn by Protestant fire. In 1558, at only 16, Mary married François. The wedding was a spectacle of silks, jewels, and incense, a vision of medieval grandeur. Trumpets blared, bells tolled, and the people of Paris cheered as Mary, radiant in white and gold, was crowned the bride of France. It seemed a fairy tale fulfilled, the child queen of Scotland, now the Dauphine of France, soon to be queen of two realms. But fairy tales have sharp edges. François, delicate and frail, was no warrior king. Within 2 years, he was dead, carried off by illness. Mary, widowed before her 18th birthday, found herself dressed in black, her golden future collapsing into ash. In the halls of the Louvre, she walked like a ghost, still regal, still luminous, but with eyes that held the sorrow of a woman twice her age. For the second time, the crown became a curse. France no longer had need of her, and Scotland, turbulent and restless, awaited her return. With the echo of funeral bells still ringing in her ears, Mary boarded a ship back across the stormy seas. Behind her lay the grandeur of France. Before her, the wild lands of Scotland, and a destiny written not in silk and jewels, but in blood and betrayal. The stage was set. Mary was no longer a child queen. She was a young widow, tempered by the fire of grief, armed with beauty, intelligence, and ambition. She carried in her veins the claim not only to Scotland, but to England itself, a claim that would one day pit her against her cousin Elizabeth. But for now, she sailed homeward, unaware that the storms of love and power awaiting her in Scotland would prove deadlier than any sea. In August 1561, a ship cut through the misty waters of the Firth of Forth, carrying a queen home. After 13 years in France, Mary Stuart, now 19, returned to Scotland. The bells of Edinburgh tolled, crowds gathered in awe, and yet there was unease in the air. Scotland was no longer the land she had left as a child. It was a realm torn by religious war, suspicion, and the growing thunder of Protestant reform. Mary's arrival was like a storm breaking over the Highlands. She was tall, radiant, her French gowns shimmering with silks unseen in Edinburgh. She spoke with elegance, her voice carrying both authority and a foreign softness. To the common people, she seemed almost otherworldly, too graceful, too dazzling, too perfect for their harsh, rain-swept land. To the Protestant lords, led by the fiery preacher John Knox, she was dangerous, a Catholic queen in a kingdom on the verge of abandoning Rome. But Mary had learned the art of power in France. She charmed her subjects, hunted in the Highlands, played the lute in candlelit halls. She became the glittering star of her court, turning Edinburgh Castle into a palace of music, poetry, and intrigue. Foreign ambassadors wrote home of her beauty, her wit, her skill in debate. She was, in every sense, a queen who seemed destined not just to rule, but to conquer history itself. Yet Mary's greatest rise would come not from politics, but from love, or what seemed, at first, to be love. In 1565, she met Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, a tall, handsome nobleman with royal blood of his own. Darnley was English, a great-grandson of Henry VII, which made him a perfect consort, and, dangerously, gave him his own claim to the English throne. Mary was captivated by him, his charm, his youth, his dazzling presence at tournaments. Courtiers whispered that the two were inseparable, their glances burning across crowded halls, their walks in the gardens stretching long into twilight. Within months, they married. The union was celebrated with bonfires, music, and feasts. To Mary, it seemed the perfect alliance, love and politics entwined. She was young, in love, and, once again, she believed destiny was on her side. But if Mary was the fire, Darnley was smoke, handsome on the surface, but hollow and suffocating within. The marriage soured almost immediately. Darnley was arrogant, jealous, and reckless. He demanded the crown matrimonial, equal power to Mary, the right to rule in his own name. She refused, and the rift between them widened. At court, whispers spread like wildfire. Darnley drank, consorted with enemies, and grew paranoid that Mary favored others. His jealousy turned into rage when she showed kindness to her Italian secretary, David Rizzio, a musician whose wit and charm had made him her confidant. Then came the night that would haunt Mary forever. March 1566. Mary, pregnant with her first child, sat dining with Rizzio and her ladies in Holyrood Palace. Suddenly, the doors burst open. Darnley stormed in, his face twisted with fury, flanked by armed men. Before Mary's horrified eyes, the assassins dragged Rizzio from her side. His screams echoed through the halls as they stabbed him more than 50 times, his blood soaking the palace floor. Mary, clutching her swollen belly, was held captive by her own husband. The Queen of Scotland, humiliated, betrayed by the man she had loved. Yet even then, she displayed her iron will. She talked, pleaded, maneuvered, turning some of Darnley's allies back to her side. Within days, she was free. But her marriage was broken beyond repair. When she gave birth to her son, James, in June 1566, the future king who would unite Scotland and England, Darnley's role was already fading. He was despised by the nobles, mistrusted by Mary, and consumed by his own paranoia. By early 1567, Darnley was dead. Found strangled in a garden after an explosion ripped through the house where he lodged, his murder shocked the realm. Many whispered that Mary herself had conspired in his death. Others accused her new ally, James Hepburn, the Earl of Bothwell, of orchestrating the crime. The scandal was unstoppable, feeding rumors that Mary had traded one husband's love for another man's ambition. And yet, at this moment, Mary stood at the height of her fame and power. She was queen, mother to a future king, and still one of the most beautiful and captivating women in Europe. Her presence could fill a hall, her smile disarm an enemy, her courage inspire loyalty. But beneath the glitter, the storm gathered. The murder of Darnley was not just a crime, it was the turning point. The same passion that had fueled Mary's rise now threatened to consume her. Scotland's queen, once adored, was becoming a figure of suspicion, scandal, and division. Mary had risen higher than most dared dream. But like all who fly too close to the sun, she was about to fall. The murder of Lord Darnley had left Scotland shaken, but for Mary Stuart, it was not the end, it was the beginning of her downfall. And at the heart of the scandal stood one man, James Hepburn, the Earl of Bothwell. Bothwell was everything Darnley was not: bold, ruthless, commanding. Where Darnley sulked in jealousy, Bothwell thrived in fire and danger. To Mary, weary of betrayal and humiliation, he seemed less a suitor than a savior, a warrior who could protect her crown from the storm. But to Scotland's nobles, he was the viper who had strangled Darnley in the dark of night. Then came the most infamous chapter of Mary's life. In April 1567, as she rode back from visiting her son in Stirling, Bothwell intercepted her with a troop of armed men. Was it an abduction, a rescue, or a plot they had planned together? History remains divided, but the scene is etched in legend. A queen taken by force, carried across the rugged moors to Bothwell's stronghold, where passion and politics intertwined in a whirlwind of scandal. Within weeks, Mary married Bothwell. The wedding shocked all of Europe. A queen marrying the man suspected of murdering her husband. It was madness, treachery, or love so blind it defied reason. The Scottish lords, already restless, rose in rebellion. At Carberry Hill, Mary faced her enemies not with an army, but alone on horseback, dressed in crimson velvet, her face pale but unbroken. She surrendered, not for herself, but for the safety of Bothwell. though he fled into exile, never to see her again. Mary, Queen of Scots, the dazzling widow of France, the radiant sovereign of Scotland, was paraded through Edinburgh like a criminal. Crowds jeered, throwing insults and filth. Behind the barred windows of Loch Leven Castle, she was stripped not only of her freedom, but of her crown. Forced to abdicate in favor of her infant son, James, Mary wept as the crown of Scotland slipped forever from her grasp. Yet even in chains, she was not finished. With the charisma that had once charmed kings, she persuaded guards to aid her escape. In May 1568, disguised and desperate, she fled Loch Leven and rallied her loyalists. For a moment, Scotland trembled again beneath her banner. But at the Battle of Langside, her forces were crushed. Defeated, Mary made a choice that would seal her fate forever. She fled across the border into England, seeking refuge with her cousin, Elizabeth I. It was the gamble of a desperate queen, to throw herself at the mercy of another sovereign, a rival whose throne she also had claim to. For Mary was not just the deposed Queen of Scotland. By bloodline, as the great-granddaughter of Henry VII, she was also a legitimate heir to the English crown. To Catholics across Europe, Mary, not Elizabeth, was the true Queen of England. Elizabeth knew it, and Elizabeth never forgave it. Mary did not find refuge. She found a prison. For nearly 20 years, she was shuttled from castle to castle, never free, always guarded. The guest of Elizabeth was in truth her captive. The once glittering queen became a bird in a gilded cage. At Tutbury Castle, at Sheffield, at Chartley, she paced stone halls, embroidered silk with trembling hands, and wrote letters filled with longing and defiance. She grew ill, her once radiant beauty fading, her hair streaked with silver. And yet, she remained unbroken. To many Catholics in England, Mary was a living saint, a beacon of hope. Plots rose in her name, the Ridolfi plot, the Babington plot, schemes to assassinate Elizabeth and place Mary upon the throne. Whether Mary herself conspired remains a matter of history's endless debate, but for Elizabeth, the danger was clear. As long as Mary lived, England's crown was threatened. And so, Elizabeth signed the death warrant of her own cousin. It was the final betrayal. Mary had lost her throne, her freedom, her youth, her loves, and now, she was to lose her life. The queen who once dazzled the French court, who rode through Scotland in triumph, who defied scandal and rebellion, was reduced to a prisoner awaiting the executioner's axe. Her downfall was not a single moment, but a slow crushing by the relentless gears of history, grinding down a woman of flesh and blood into a symbol of tragedy. Mary Stuart had once risen like a star across the skies of Europe. Now, she burned as a martyr in the making. Fotheringhay Castle, February 8, 1587. The winter dawn broke gray and merciless over the stone towers, the air sharp as a blade. Inside the great hall, torches flared against the damp walls, casting shadows that seemed to shiver in anticipation. A scaffold loomed in the center, draped in black. At its side, the axe gleamed, cold, heavy, final. The crowd gathered, lords, courtiers, guards, common witnesses summoned to see justice done. Yet none could silence the whisper that rippled through the chamber. They were about to watch a queen die. Not a traitor, not a rebel, but a woman born to rule, a cousin to Elizabeth herself. It was not justice. It was theater. It was murder cloaked in law. Then the doors opened. Mary Stuart entered, 64, yet still regal, her bearing unbowed by 2 decades of captivity. She wore a gown of somber black, but beneath it, as she let the robe fall away, a shock of crimson glared, the color of martyrdom, of sacrifice, of defiance. Gasps rippled through the hall. It was not a condemned woman who mounted the scaffold, but a queen prepared for her final coronation. She held a crucifix in one hand, a rosary in the other. "I die a Catholic," she declared, her voice clear as a bell. "Faithful to the true Church. May God forgive those who have thirsted for my blood." Some in the crowd crossed themselves, tears streaking their cheeks. Others looked away, ashamed of what they had come to witness. Kneeling before the block, Mary prayed softly. Her ladies wept, clutching the hem of her gown. The executioner approached, his face hidden beneath a black hood, his hands trembling despite his strength. He knelt, begging her forgiveness. "I forgive you with all my heart," Mary answered. "For now, you will give me rest." The hall held its breath. The axe fell, but not cleanly. The first blow struck the back of her head, glancing off bone. A groan erupted from the crowd as Mary's body jerked. The second stroke landed harder, cutting deep but not through. Only on the third did the head fall free, rolling into the straw, crimson soaking the scaffold. A gasp, then a cry of horror swept through the hall. From beneath the queen's gown, a small dog, hidden in her skirts, leapt out and threw itself upon her severed body, whimpering, refusing to be pulled away. The sight shattered even the hardest of hearts. Soldiers wiped tears they had sworn not to shed. For in that moment, the execution was no triumph of law, but the spectacle of a saint destroyed. The executioner raised Mary's head to the crowd, crying, "God save the Queen." But fate mocked him, for as he lifted it, the lips still moved faintly, whether from a spasm or divine miracle, no one dared say. The head slipped from his grasp, falling to the floor with a dull thud, hair burning red beneath the torchlight. In that instant, Mary Stuart ceased to be a woman of flesh and blood. She became myth. Word of her death spread like wildfire across Europe. To Catholic kingdoms, she was a martyr of faith, a queen murdered for her loyalty to Rome. To Protestants, she was a traitor undone by her conspiracies. To Elizabeth, she was both a relief and a curse, the rival extinguished, yet at the cost of her own honor. Elizabeth wept when the news reached her, claiming she had not meant the warrant to be carried out so soon. But her tears could not erase the stain. And to the people, Mary's end was unforgettable. Pamphlets, ballads, paintings spread the image of the Crimson Queen meeting death with grace. Even her enemies admitted she died with courage. History itself seemed to tremble, as though a page had been turned not by ink, but by blood. Mary's tragedy was complete. She had been queen at 6 days old, bride of France at 16, mother of a king at 23. She had known crowns, courts, and castles. She had known passion, betrayal, and prison. And now, she knew the axe. But death did not silence her. It immortalized her, for in dying, Mary Stuart became larger than life, a queen without a throne, a woman without freedom, yet a figure who would haunt Elizabeth's reign and echo across the centuries. When the axe fell at Fotheringhay, it did not end Mary Stuart's story. It ignited it. Her blood seeped into the wooden boards of the scaffold, but from that blood bloomed a legend that Europe could never forget. In life, she had been a queen without a kingdom, a pawn of politics, a woman caged by suspicion. In death, she became a martyr. To Catholics across Europe, her crimson gown was not a costume, it was a banner. Priests preached of her courage, poets sang of her sacrifice, and whispers spread that she had died not merely for herself, but for the faith of millions. In Spain, France, Rome, her name was spoken like a prayer, Santa Maria, la Reina Martyr. Elizabeth I, though triumphant, could never escape the shadow of that execution. The Virgin Queen, master of diplomacy and power, had stained her reign with the blood of her own kin. In private, she raged at her counselors, wept bitter tears, and cursed the warrant she herself had signed. She had destroyed her rival, but in so doing, she had forged her rival's immortality. For history would never remember Elizabeth's ink as strongly as it remembered Mary's blood. Mary's son, James VI of Scotland, later James I of England, would inherit both crowns, fulfilling the dream Mary had once carried in her heart, the unification of Scotland and England under one monarch. In this strange twist of fate, the woman branded traitor and exile gave birth to the very dynasty that would define Britain's future. And the people, they never let her go. Ballads told of her beauty, her courage, her tears. Painters froze her final walk in strokes of oil and light. Playwrights turned her tragedy into theater, dressing her as both saint and siren. Centuries later, she would become a figure of fascination for romantics and rebels, feminists and filmmakers, a woman too alive, too radiant, too human for the world she was born into. Mary, Queen of Scots, lived as a sovereign but died as a symbol. She was the bird in the gilded cage, singing until the blade cut short her song. She was the queen who lost everything but dignity. She was the woman who turned her own destruction into an eternal crown. And so, across the centuries, one question lingers like an echo in the dark. Was Mary the victim of fate, crushed by history's ruthless hand? Or was she the architect of her own ruin, too passionate, too reckless, too alive to ever survive the cold machinery of power? Perhaps the truth lies in both. Perhaps that is why her story endures. For Mary Stuart was not just a queen of Scotland. She was a queen of tragedy.